All right. Hope everyone is doing well. Yeah, everyone is doing well. Kind of sort of realized my computer is not plugged in. Okay, there it is. Yeah, so I've been reading The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, Thomas Ligotti. It's kind of just been like it was supposed to be like a kind of pick me up kind of read, except I like my pick me up kind of reads are I like reading things that are, you know, in the mood that I'm in. um, so yeah, but anyways, I for a while, like a good chunk of the book, I would say, maybe a little less than half, maybe it's not a good chunk, but I'd say a good third of the book. Um, what Thomas Ligotti has to say is, not anything I kind of already heard. Like I've kind of already heard these arguments before. Um, but I was reading through a bit more, and I got really surprised about some of the arguments that I think are, somewhat original, but also I've just never heard of them. I've never heard of these arguments before. Um, and so I think Ligotti provides some interesting arguments with determinism and this idea of free will. And actually, Thomas Ligotti kind of just says, like, even if we had a determinist position on life, we still can't really escape. Like, it seems almost impossible to escape the fact that we still feel free when we do things. And I thought that was actually a very interesting argument. But like, you can really see the different side of this pessimism, because the different side is that actually we sort of need this deception to function in life, um, and it seems almost necessary. Um, and what I really like here is his expansion on another kind of like neurophilosopher, Thomas Metzinger. And I'll just kind of read this passage here because I thought this was interesting, so you guys can hear the Metzinger's paradox. Um, Ligotti writes, he goes, perhaps foremost in the investigation of selfism and egoology is the field of neuroscience. Therein may be found a dense and technical literature antithetical to the everyday world of the everyday self. In Being No One, for example, the German neurophilosopher Thomas Metzinger provides a theory of how the brain manufactures the subjective sense of our existence as discrete selves. Even though, as Metzinger explains, we would be more rigorously categorized as information processing systems for which it is expedient in an existential sense to create the illusion of being someone. In Metzinger's schema, a human being is not a person, but a mechanicalistically functioning phenomenal self-model that simulates a person. The reason we cannot examine these models is that we see through them. And so we cannot see the processes of the models themselves. If we could, we would know there is nothing to us but these models. This might be called Metzinger's paradox. You cannot know what you really are, because then you would know there is nothing to know and nothing to know it. What now? So rather than being no nothings, we exist in a condition of what Metzinger described as naive realism, with things not being knowable as they really are in themselves, something every scientist, and philosopher knows. And he expands how to some degree, like, it's, the thesis is somewhat inadequate, Um, but what I really like that sort of Ligotti adds to this idea is something that, is what I really like that Ligotti adds to determinism and free will, for example, is in another section he goes, and this is a question that Metzinger eventually asks. He goes, would this not be another version of Metzinger asking, can one really believe in determinism without going insane? But totally impossible, just as it would be impossible for someone to say, I am nothing but a human puppet, and continue to live as he or she had lived before, ? It does not seem likely that you could ever see yourself as what you are per Metzinger. You would then know the horror and know that you know it. No longer would it be impossible to believe that you are nothing but a human puppet. What now? ? Answers. Now we go insane. Now our species goes extinct in great epidemics of madness. Because now we know that behind the scenes of life, there's something pernicious that makes a nightmare of our world. Now we know that we are uncanny paradoxes. We know that nature has veered into the supernatural by fabricating a creature that cannot and should not exist by natural law and yet does. So this is what is really interesting about Ligotti, because he's even saying, like, he's basically saying, like, even if we could, right? Even if this thesis was true, right? That we had this phenomenal self models constructed by our brain, and that we couldn't see them because we are these self models, basically. Ligotti is saying, like, imagine if you could know it. Like, it would be horrifying. It would be terrifying to the human subject. And so in this sense, like, it almost seems necessary that this deception exists. Like, it seems necessary. And so, I mean, it really does put into question, right? Like, and this is what's interesting about, like, certain versions of, like, pessimistic philosophy is, like, Thomas Ligotti is like, well, it's tragic that we have to lie to ourselves in some ways, because in reality, we might actually just be this kind of nothing. But it is interesting. I mean, it's I think he really provides, like, a sort of interesting twist to the pessimistic free will determinist, because he's basically saying, like, yeah, to be determinist is almost an impossible position, even though logically we could get there, but, like, to actually behave in that manner. And this actually might shed light on, like, people that claim to be nihilists. Like, it'd be impossible to be so, because actually to be actually nihilist would be to perhaps go insane, because the necessary deception is what keeps us acting and being in the world. And that's really what I find interesting about what Ligotti has to say about this. But he does add, like, if this is a part of evolutionary thing, then it would take a very long time. So I'll read this part. He says, and he kind of adds to this, he goes, and Metzinger's preoccupation with the suffering of sentient beings matches that of any pessimist. The only difference is in his opinion of how we may eliminate or greatly ameliorate this suffering. In any event, while Metzinger has been audacious enough to state that there are aspects of the scientific worldview which may be damaging to our mental well-being, and that is what everybody intuitively feels, quotes, this is what Metzinger says, he himself feels that everybody may not always feel that way, and that the risk-benefit calculation will add up in our favor. What else could a neurophilosopher believe that we should give up on ourselves and go extinct? Question mark. Metzinger must have faith that once the rest of humanity has seen through the game, that means the game of the fact that we have these fake, simulated, phenomenal selves that is constructed from the brain, right? But right now, the truth would be too hard to bear. But Metzinger's idea is like, oh, well, I think over time, like the truth will be more bearable. And this is what Thomas Ligotti is commenting on. He's like, Metzinger must have faith that once the rest of humanity has seen through the game, we will, in all sincerity, and not as pretenders, play through to a world in which day by day, in every way, we are getting better and better. But that will take time, lots of it. And then he gives an example of like how even like Darwin's theory of evolution is still rejected by people who believe in God, and so on, and all that stuff. So I do find that interesting. That's I don't know if it doesn't appear to me like Ligotti's entertaining, but he does seem to be bringing out the pessimistic roots of like, if we entertain this neurophilosopher's idea that we have these, that we're actually not a human subject, but more like human puppets, we're human puppets, and we actually don't have any will or anything. The interesting parts that Thomas Ligotti adds is like, one, it seems impossible to actually be determinist because the idea of willing something seems to be a necessary lie, a necessary deception, and that's rooted in another more fundamental deception, which is this idea of having a self. And it seems like if we were to see through the fact that we didn't have a self, like in a real way, not like in a Buddhist way, then perhaps we would actually go insane, And like this is like the neuroscientist kind of like logic that he's borrowing from Metzinger is like, well, we might go insane actually if we could see that we were just nothing but these phenomenal self models that the brain constructed for being in the world. And of course, the other thing that I find really interesting is like Ligotti also arguing the fact of just like, it's also impossible because we can't escape feeling the feeling of freedom, of being that we feel free. Like we can logically get to something like determinism or logically get to something like we are nothing, but we can't escape the feeling of being free. But then the other speculation is like, well, maybe we could, but over time, and this is why he's like commenting on Metzinger. But I really like here what he says about like emotions and the self. He goes, but a major depression causes your emotions to evaporate, reducing you to a shell of a person standing alone in a drab landscape. Emotions are the substrate for the illusion of being a somebody among somebodies, as well as for the substance we think we see in the world. Not knowing this ground level truth of human existence is the equivalent of knowing nothing at all. Although varying in intensity and nature, our emotions must seem ever stable in their concatenation, just as a mixed drink must be made with specific ingredients in the same relative amount so that they may blend into a vodka, martini, or pina colada. United, our emotions ostensibly form a master self to which anomalous secondary selves may be compared for quality. Even as they are ever trading places or running together within us, clearly cut or amorphous, the experience of these biological twitterings makes it nearly impossible to doubt that they will stay with us as far as we can see into the future. Ask any couple who cannot imagine being without each other, a vital fiction without which, besides the fact that it often leads to procreation, no society could exist. It would have no reason to do so. because reason is merely the mouthpiece of emotion. Yeah, so this is I mean, again, like, this is really fascinating, and I've definitely heard of these like theories before, right? Like there's um Jonathan Haidt. He's like a big psychology evolutionary guy. I read a lot about him in my religion and psychology kind of spirituality class. He also argued, like, when it comes to like moral reason, he's like borrowing from Hume here, right? Hume is the big thing in this. That reasons are like the slave of passion, right? Like that's Hume's logic. Jonathan Haidt and like even Ligotti seems to be playing into this as well, right? Like that actually it seems to be emotions that create this kind of static sense of self. And I think that actually goes into the argument of like it creates the illusion of being. And that's a very interesting thing. Like, why would emotions create the illusion of being when we can get logically like into this abstract idea of just like, oh yeah, actually we have no will. Like, so the determinist logic is actually would be very logical in some sense, but we also can escape this feeling of freedom, of doing, of being a self. And that seems to be more predicated on the phenomenology or the plethora of emotions that are qualitatively and quantitatively compared. Um, you know, so I mean, it's anyways, like I've said this word a million times, like I just find it like kind of fascinating actually. And I think Ligotti's kind of adding some interesting commentary on this. Like I've never heard a pessimist kind of argue just like, yeah, I mean, but it would also be impossible for us to actually be determinist in our day-to-day life. And these are the reasons why. And of course, it seems that he's also entertaining the alternative, which is maybe in time we will be able to see that through. And Nietzsche kind of also entertains that perspective because he's very much into the cyclical evolutionary perspective of just like it would take a long time to get to the point of understanding something about ourselves or for the deception to eradicate. But for Ligotti, the deception of having a self is much more rooted than like having a god, a family, or whatever. Like for him, those are just like at the bottom is the idea of a self. That is the illusion of it all. But anyways, those are just like my thoughts. I just kind of find it fascinating. Because like for a while I was reading Ligotti and I was like, yeah, I'm not really sure if he's adding anything interesting to the conversation. But now he does seem to be adding a lot of great stuff to the conversation to think about. The next question would be like, well, why, if we take what is true or if we take what is proposed, like why would emotions create an illusion of being? And then the other question is like, well, and why would that be necessary? And a part of the pessimist argument is like, actually, it would be necessary because then the tragic part is like, if we were to discover it abruptly, we would go insane, because the paradox is that if you're no one, then there's no one that dies. Like that's like the weird thing. Like then there's nothing in a sense, um, no self as such, right? And then it's like, then what is this being that seemingly cares and feels and goes about the world? Like that would be very hard. Like you would go insane by that logic, because then that self doesn't have the staticness that it seemingly portrays. So yeah, anyways, those are the questions and thoughts that kind of surface with that. All right, guys, take care. Thanks for watching.